The little girl was curled up in a corner of the house, right next to a pile of discarded food, with the trash can wobbling dangerously close by. These distressing actions were the handiwork of her new stepmother. But the truth that would later come to light would reveal a painful secret about this woman. Just as all this was unfolding, the girl's father returned home, a man who would soon give up his professional ambitions to try and rebuild the bond and trust with his young daughter. What city are you watching this video from and what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. Get comfortable and relax while you listen to this story. I sincerely hope it acts as a gentle catalyst for a deep and restorative rest tonight. And now let's begin. Amelia Lawson had passed away at the start of spring, but winter seemed to have settled permanently in the Harper household. The kitchen, which once overflowed with her contagious, joyful laughter and the warm aroma of freshly baked apple pie, had turned into a museum of memories. The scent of the pie still floated in the air, but it had turned cold and sharp, a bitter reminder that everything beautiful is destined to fade. Edward Harper was a successful architect, a man specialized in building firm, unshakable structures. However, within the four walls of his own home, he was nothing more than a pile of silent rubble. He didn't cry. Men don't cry. He repeated this to himself over and over, even when he felt his heart emptying out, leaving only a heavy, lifeless hollow. Work became his only armor. He immersed himself in it, leaving early and returning late, all to avoid the silent ghost of the grand piano that dominated the living room. Lucy, 8 years old, was the invisible victim of this emotional collapse. Edward believed his daughter was strong. He watched her every morning tie her hair into a ponytail, button up her school uniform, and walk down the stairs alone. But that apparent strength wasn't true resilience. It was a defense mechanism, an art she had learned to survive in the emotional vacuum surrounding her. Lucy's breakfast was always a silent ritual. She sat at the enormous oak table, her gaze fixed on the cup of lukewarm milk, where a thin film had solidified on the surface. No one rushed her. No one asked her about her day at school. Lucy ate only to stay alive, not to enjoy the food. Helen Vance, the faithful housekeeper, witnessed it all. She had worked with the Harper family since Amelia was a young newlywed. Helen loved Lucy as if she were her own granddaughter. But the recent tragedy had erected an invisible wall between them. One afternoon, when the setting sun cast long shadows across the floorboards, Helen saw the little girl sitting at the piano. That piano, Amelia's soul, had remained silent since her death. Lucy wasn't playing music. She was simply pressing one key, a single note. Then she would release it, as if searching for something lost within the sound. Afterward, she would get up and walk away, letting that solitary note hang there, dissolving slowly into the heavy air. Helen understood that Lucy was trapped in the same desperate loneliness as her father. That night, Edward didn't return until 9. The house was dark, except for the faint yellow light escaping from Lucy's room. He heard a small, dry cough, a sound loud enough to pierce through the thick layer of indifference he tried to maintain. He opened the door to his daughter's room. The study desk, which Amelia had always kept spotless and organized, was now covered in cookie wrappers, gum wrappers, and half-eaten bags of chips. Lucy was asleep in bed, but the blanket was bunched up at her feet, and a textbook lay on the floor. Edward suddenly felt a pang of irritation, not at the mess, but at the unacceptable neglect. It felt like an open wound within the perfect order he was trying to reconstruct. Lucy. Edward's voice sounded harsh and tense. The girl woke up with a start, eyes wide with panic, looking at her father with fear. She didn't move. She only shrank further against the wall. In that raw instant, his daughter's naked terror melted Edward's anger. He didn't see a disobedient child, but a caged bird. Edward walked over, picked up the book, and placed it on the desk. Then he looked at the wrappers and understood that Lucy was trying to comfort herself with sugar, a desperate attempt to fill the void. He didn't say a word. He simply hugged her. The hug was clumsy and stiff, but it was all he could offer in that moment. "I'm sorry, honey. Forgive me," he whispered, his voice cracking. He felt completely helpless. He could build an entire city, but he didn't know how to repair a broken heart. Helen understood that time was no longer on Edward's side. After a long, sleepless night, she knocked on his bedroom door. "Mr. Harper," she said in a tone that was serene but firm. "The girl needs another presence. Someone who is actually here. Even if that person can't be Amelia. You can't keep being a weekend dad." Edward turned his back to her and looked out the window, where the morning dew still clung to the glass. "I don't want a stranger. I'm afraid they'll disrupt things." "Things are already disrupted, sir. Lucy is learning to disappear inside her own house." Helen's words were like a sharp knife. Edward knew she was right. He was so consumed with rebuilding his own facade that he had forgotten his daughter was crumbling, bit by bit. A week later, Edward went to the hospital for his routine checkup, a habit Amelia had always insisted he maintain. In the cold hallway, he ran into Claire Miller. She was a nurse with ash-blonde hair and deep eyes, the same woman who had silently cared for Amelia during her final months. Claire recognized him immediately. She approached, bowing her head with sincere respect. "Mr. Harper, I am so sorry about Amelia," she said with a soft voice, yet charged with deep sadness. Edward nodded. "Thank you, Claire." After a few minutes of superficial conversation, Claire hesitated. "How is Lucy?" "I still think about her. Thank you." Edward was a bit surprised. He had always believed nurses only remembered their patients. Claire lowered her gaze to her hands, where a faint scar was visible. "I still think about her every time I hear the rain," she said. That phrase touched something in Edward in a strange way. To him, rain had always meant mourning and sadness. But for Claire, it seemed like a more intimate, personal reminder. It wasn't a phrase of comfort, but on an impulse, or perhaps an act of pure desperation, Edward made a proposal. "Claire, would you consider helping me? Looking after Lucy part-time? She needs someone close by." Claire looked up, her expression oscillating between surprise and an emotion, impossible to read, as if she had just received absolution or a sentence. After a long silence, she nodded. "I will, Mr. Harper. I want to help her." "Thank you." A few days later, Claire Miller arrived at the Harper house on the outskirts of Seattle. Her arrival was quiet. She brought a small suitcase and a peculiar serenity, the sweetness of someone who had witnessed immense loss. She moved lightly, as if afraid to break the invisible fragments of Amelia that still floated in the air. Edward felt an unexpected relief. He saw something healing in Claire, a fresh current that could dissipate the emotional ice weighing on the house. She had lived with death, so he thought, she must understand life. He believed she could bring peace. But Helen Vance, leaning against the kitchen doorframe, watched her as Claire meticulously arranged a vase of flowers in the exact same spot where Amelia used to put them. Helen didn't see peace. She saw tension. When Claire turned, her gaze accidentally passed over Helen, and in those eyes, the older woman perceived something deeply unsettling. Not the joy of serving, but a buried fear. It wasn't the anxiety of arriving at a new home, but the terror of facing an old responsibility. Helen shuddered. She had the strange sensation that this woman hadn't come to help Lucy, but to settle an invisible debt with a past that refused to die. Claire had arrived like a rising tide, erasing every trace of the chaos left behind after Amelia's death. She didn't speak much. Her movements were measured, almost mechanical. At dawn, long before Edward opened his eyes, she was already in the kitchen. She wasn't like Helen, who used to hum old songs while mopping the floor. Claire moved in silence, leaving behind shelves perfectly organized by size and color, and cushions aligned like soldiers on parade. Edward felt calm. That sense of order was exactly what he craved after months of drifting aimlessly. He started talking to Claire more frequently. Not about love, but about logistics. "How much did Lucy eat today? Did she cough again?" Claire always responded with exact numbers. Her precision gave Edward the illusion that, finally, life was under control. After 3 months on a quiet night, Edward made a sudden decision, an act destined to preserve that new order. He proposed to Claire. There was no diamond ring or romance, just a practical question. Would you like to stay here? Officially? Claire remained silent for a long time. Her eyes trembled slightly, as if struggling against a weight she couldn't name. I'm not sure I can replace Amelia. I don't need you to replace her, Edward replied calmly. I just need someone to keep this home standing. And you've done that beautifully. He didn't realize the thin line between maintaining order and creating love. The wedding was simple but full of polite joy. Edward invited a few close colleagues. Helen tried to smile. The festive atmosphere barely managed to disguise the tension hiding underneath. Toasts were made, laughter rose, and guests praised the new wife for bringing life back to a house that had felt dead for so long. Lucy wore a white lace dress, hiding behind Claire's skirt, eyes fixed on a flickering candle. The flame danced just like the confusion inside her small heart. Helen, however, was not at peace. Since Claire became Mrs. Harper, the house had become quieter. Too quiet. It was the silence of something sealed shut, a place where feelings were locked away and oppressed. Lucy's laughter had almost disappeared. She didn't hate Claire. She simply felt no warmth from her. Claire's voice was soft, but it carried a subtle chill. One afternoon, Claire was teaching Lucy how to draw a daisy. She didn't allow her to use the red crayon. Only white and green. Why can't I use red, Mom? The little girl asked quietly. Claire put down the pencil and looked at the girl's hand. Red is the color of haste, honey. We must do things slowly. Everything has to be in order. Lucy lowered her head. Claire understood it this way. For Claire, control was worth more than emotion. Claire tried to connect. She read her stories before bed, though every time she reached the part where Snow White's stepmother embraced her stepdaughter, her voice would speed up, skipping words. Deep down, she held a silent fear. If she ever loved Lucy too much, if she dared to hug her tightly, the guilt over Amelia's death would return with force to drown her. The accident that rainy night, the one she believed she could have prevented, had left a wound that never closed. Claire couldn't love fully. To her, love was dangerous. One night, Edward returned home and found Claire and Lucy in the living room. The scene seemed perfect. Lucy was reading Alice in Wonderland, an old copy that had belonged to Amelia, and Claire sat in an armchair, silently mending one of Edward's shirts. Not a single word was heard. Everything seems peaceful, Edward said, feeling pleased. Yes, Claire lifted her head and sketched a faint smile. Yes, everything is under control. Edward believed that meant harmony. But Helen, watching from the kitchen doorway, saw it differently. It was the kind of calm that belongs to people too tired to make mistakes. Every movement was rehearsed, every word calculated. Not to create peace, but to avoid disturbing the balance, Helen started noticing the small details. Claire always served exactly 4 dishes, even though 2 would have been enough. She hung Lucy's lace dresses always in the same corner under the porch roof, right in the spot where Amelia used to hang the laundry. There the shade was constant. The sun never touched that corner. One July afternoon, a sudden downpour lashed the house out Seattle. Helen rushed out to bring in the laundry, only to discover that Claire was already there. Lucy's little lace dresses were soaked, sticking heavily to the line. Instead of running to rescue them, Claire stood motionless, staring at the rain darkening the fabric. Mrs. Claire! Helen called out softly. The clothes are getting soaked. Claire didn't turn around. Her voice sounded calm, but there was something disturbing in her serenity. The rain cleans everything, Helen. It washes it. It erases it. Helen shuddered. She didn't know if that was a simple comment about laundry or a veiled confession, a cryptic need to cleanse something buried deep within Claire's soul. It seemed Claire was desperately trying to preserve Amelia's memory while simultaneously punishing herself for it. Claire didn't know that inside Lucy, something fragile had begun to sprout, a feeling too undefined to have a name. The girl didn't fear her stepmother, nor did she hate her. She was simply sad. A silent, piercing sadness, as if everyone in that house was still waiting for someone who would never return. The order within the Harper house, carefully constructed by Claire with precision and fear, was nothing more than a fragile wall held up by evasion and silence. In the weeks following the wedding, peace had settled like dust, thick, motionless, suffocating. And Lucy seemed to fade a little more each day, desperately trying to please everyone, becoming smaller, softer, quieter. Her voice never rose above a whisper. Her steps barely grazed the floor. That morning, before leaving for a business trip, Edward stopped by the window, watching the leaves fall. For a moment the peace seemed real. He turned and saw Claire cleaning the living room furniture. "Everything is okay, right?" he asked with a hopeful smile, seeking confirmation. Claire stood still, squeezing the rag tightly in her hands. "Yes, Edward. Everything is in its place. Don't worry." She didn't look him in the eyes. She focused on an invisible spot on a picture frame. For Edward, order meant happiness. He kissed her forehead before leaving, convinced that logic and structure could cure any emotional wound. Helen left earlier than usual that morning, saying she had family matters to attend to. But looking back one last time at the house, she noticed how Claire closed the window with too much force, as if trying to seal out the sounds of the world. A knot of uneasiness tightened in Helen's chest. The house felt heavy, as if a single wrong noise could make it collapse. That night, it began to rain. Not a storm, but a slow, constant drizzle that tapped on the roof like a metronome. Inside, only Claire and Lucy remained. Dinner was served at exactly 7 p.m., 4 dishes carefully arranged, gleaming under the warm light. They sat opposite each other in silence. The only sound was the faint clinking of silverware against porcelain, measured, mechanical, cold. Lucy was exhausted. She had spent the whole day at school pretending to be fine while other children teased her for not having a real mom. Her throat hurt from holding back tears. Her hands trembled slightly when she reached out to take her spoon. Then, it slipped. Clang. The metallic sound hit the marble floor sharp, unforgiving. It cut the silence like breaking glass. A small piece of buttered bread rolled off the plate and fell next to the spoon. Clang. Lucy froze. Her shoulders tensed. She looked down at the floor, bracing herself not for a slap, but for the words she feared most. But Claire said nothing. Her gaze stopped on the fallen piece of bread, then shifted to the girl's terrified face. In that instant, the trembling features of the little girl blurred, and another face took its place. Amelia's. That night. The rain. The plea for help. And death. Mrs. Lawson. "I can't breathe." Amelia's weak voice resonated in Claire's mind. She had ignored it. She had left her shift at City General early, too anxious to stay, too tired to care. She hadn't taken the patient's freezing hand. She had walked away, abandoning the one being who needed her most. Now the rain outside whispered the same rhythm. And the girl in front of her, scared, fragile, eyes full of guilt, became a living accusation. That small piece of bread on the floor was enough to break something very deep inside Claire. The dam she had built within herself cracked. She no longer saw Lucy. She saw her own failure. Her own guilt reflected in those eyes. Her voice exploded, hoarse and trembling. "You always do the same thing. Why do you never learn? Why can't you keep things in order just for once? Why do you have to ruin everything you touch?" Lucy shrank in her chair, fingers clutching the edge of the table. Tears ran down silently, thin, trembling, but contained, because she knew any noise would only make things worse. Claire's words kept falling, heavy and sharp like stones thrown against her own past. "Everything is already hard enough. Why can't you do a single thing, right? Do you have any idea the chaos you cause?" She was no longer speaking to Lucy. She was speaking to herself, to the night Amelia died. But all that pain was now pouring onto the small, defenseless girl sitting across from her. Then came the phrase that shattered the last trace of safety in that room. Claire pointed at the fallen bread. Her voice turned icy. "Your dinner," she said slowly, "belongs in the trash. Because you don't deserve the order of this house." The air thickened. Even the rain outside seemed to stop. Lucy didn't sob. She simply looked at the bread, then at Claire. There was no hate in her eyes, only a silent, resigned understanding that pain was now her destiny. Without saying a word, she got up. Step by step, she walked toward the kitchen trash can. With trembling fingers, she picked up the spoon, then the piece of bread, now stained with dust. She held it delicately in her small palm and let it drop into the can. Claire's breath stopped. Her eyes went wide. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The sight of that obedient act, the silent dignity of a child humiliated beyond all reason, wounded her deeper than any scream. The kitchen remained silent except for the faint tapping of the rain and Claire's ragged breathing, and in that silence, she understood what she had done. She had turned her own fear into a weapon and used it against the only person more fragile than herself. When Helen returned around 10 p.m., the house was wrapped in darkness. Only the kitchen light shone weakly. She entered and froze. The dining table was spotless, but the trash can was knocked over, with crumbs scattered across the floor. On the sofa, Lucy was curled up with a book on her lap, staring into the void. Claire had no visible wounds, but the silence around her was a wound deeper than any bruise. Claire was nowhere to be seen. Helen ran to the girl and hugged her tightly. "What happened, my love?" she whispered. Lucy clung to her sleeve. After a long pause, she murmured in a barely audible voice, "I dropped my spoon. Mom said my dinner belongs in the garbage." Helen couldn't respond. Her throat burned. She knew the perfect order Claire had built had finally cracked. And what was seeping out wasn't peace, but pain. That night, Helen sat down and wrote to Edward. Her pen trembled as she formed each word. "You have to come home. You need to see the truth, not what you want to believe. She cannot love this child, Edward. Her fear is too strong." Upstairs, Claire stood motionless at the edge of the bed. Her simple wedding dress still hung in the closet, white and untouched. Her hands shook as tears ran down her cheeks. But she wasn't crying out of regret. She was crying in horror because she no longer knew who she had punished, the girl in front of her, or the ghost of the woman she once failed to save. Order had been her shield, and now chaos had seeped through the cracks and consumed everything. Edward returned at dawn, with the rain still whispering against the windshield. He had driven all night after receiving Helen's urgent call, even before he had time to open the letter she had sent. Entering the house, the humid air clung to his body, thick with silence. But it wasn't the kind of calm Claire usually created. It was the silence of something suffocating, the kind that arrives when everything good has been drained away. The kitchen light was still on. When Edward entered, what he saw froze him. Lucy, his little girl, was curled up in a corner, holding a few crumbs of bread in trembling hands. The trash can was overturned, and food scraps covered the floor. She wasn't crying, and that made it even worse. Double quotes Lucy. Her eyes were empty, fixed on the floor, devoid of everything a child should feel. "Lucy!" Edward fell to his knees beside her. "What happened, sweetheart?" She looked at him, her voice barely audible. I dropped the spoon. Mom said my dinner is there." That single simple phrase, devastating, destroyed him. There was no anger in her tone, nor sadness. It was resignation. The acceptance by a child of a cruelty she didn't deserve. Edward's chest tightened as if his heart had turned to ice. Everything he had trusted about Claire's order now seemed like a lie. He lifted her into his arms. Lucy clung to his neck, her small body shaking. Edward looked around. Helen wasn't there. Perhaps she had gone back to her room. And then he saw her. Claire was standing by the window, rain beating against the glass behind her. She didn't run. She didn't hide. Her hands trembled as she clasped them, and in her eyes flickered guilt and something darker, desperation. Edward placed Lucy on a wooden chair. His voice came out low, trembling with contained rage. "What did you do?" Claire's lips quivered. "Edward, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to?" His tone cut the air like a cold steel blade. You told my 8-year-old daughter her food belonged in the trash because she dropped a spoon? He took a step toward her. Each footfall heavy, deliberate. Is that your idea of maintaining order? Filling her heart with fear? Claire's face turned pale. All the guilt she had buried, the memories of Amelia, the woman she couldn't save, came back like a storm. She was no longer facing Edward. She was facing her own reflection. The woman who had failed once and had done it again. I just wanted silence. She screamed, her voice cracking. I just wanted peace. Even if just for once. Why can't she stay still? Why does chaos follow me wherever I go? I've tried so hard to keep everything in order. To keep everything in order. Edward's laugh was bitter. You are not maintaining order, Claire. You are punishing a child for something she didn't do. Why, Claire? You've turned your guilt into her fear. Amelia's gone, Claire. But Lucy is still here. She isn't your chance to redeem yourself. She is my daughter. His words fell like thunder. Claire backed away until she hit the glass, breathing with difficulty. Claire was right. She had brought Amelia's ghost into this house. Not through memories, but through a cruelty disguised as control. Do you think I haven't tried? Claire yelled, tears running down her face. No! Every morning I wake up and try to do everything Amelia did. I try to be what you want, what Lucy needs. But every time I look at her, I see her. I see the rain of that night. I see what I lost. And I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if I love her too much, I'll destroy her too. Edward's face hardened. So your solution is to make her fear you. You think fear is protection? You are breaking her, Claire. She isn't porcelain to be locked in a cabinet, and you? Claire screamed back, words trembling in the air. Where have you been, Edward? You hide in your work. You throw money at problems and then hand me your broken pieces for me to fix. You wanted a perfect house, not a family. You wanted me to build a memory that never existed. Do you think I'm a miracle? I'm human. I make mistakes too. Edward's voice exploded, raw with pain. You are not worthy of being my wife, nor the mother of my daughter. You aren't. Claire fell silent. This time she didn't answer. Her face was soaked with rain and tears. She knew he was right. Or at least that it was no longer worth defending herself. She had come to this house seeking redemption, but the only thing she had done was reopen every wound. Edward turned around, hugging Lucy tightly against his chest. Outside, the rain intensified, drowning out Claire's sobs. Edward carried Lucy up to her room, leaving Claire alone in the kitchen, surrounded by crumbs, silence, and failure. The next morning, Edward found Claire packed and ready. She was standing at the door with a small suitcase, eyes swollen, but calm. I'm sorry, she whispered. I hurt her. I failed. Edward stopped in front of the door, exhausted. I don't know what pain you carry, Claire, he said in a low voice. But your pain doesn't give you the right to pass it on to others. You have to go. Claire nodded. There were no words left. She walked out into the rain, disappearing down the path without looking back even once. Edward watched from the window until her figure faded into the mist. The house fell silent again. But it wasn't the silence of before. This one was heavier, full of sadness and fear. That night, Lucy burned with fever. She tossed and turned in the sheets, murmuring her mother's name. Not Claire's, Amelia's. Edward stayed by her bedside all night, holding her hand, understanding how far he had drifted from being the father she needed. The tragedy wasn't just Claire's fault. It was his too. His absence, his obsession with control, his silence, his blindness. Now, alone under the dim light of the nursery, Edward finally understood. The house hadn't lost its warmth because of the rain or the arguments. It had lost it because of him. Because he had left long before Claire did, and this time if he wanted to save his daughter he would have to return. Return for real. Not as the man who built walls, but as the father who could finally hug her without fear. The Harper house felt empty after Claire's departure. No more sewing needles clicking against fabric, nor meticulous order in every corner. But there were no laughs or piano melodies running down the hall either. Only Edward and Lucy remained, trapped in an immense void that still called itself home. Edward tried to create a new rhythm for his days. He got up early, made simple breakfasts, took Lucy to school, and talked about his construction projects, adding little jokes he hoped would elicit a smile. But his voice hung in the air like dust, refusing to settle. Every time Edward spoke, Lucy lowered her head. It wasn't disobedience. It was caution. The kind learned too soon when one has known fear. One morning, while Lucy ate her toast in silence, Edward gently touched her shoulder. She went still. Every muscle in her body tensed. Her eyes blinked with a silent, instinctive fear, as if bracing for something painful that never came. Then, just as quickly, she went back to eating, polite and still. Edward withdrew his hand as if burned. That small flinch from his daughter hurt more than any wound. He understood that Lucy's fear was no longer just toward Claire. The girl had learned a cruel truth, that adults, the very people meant to protect, could just as easily become threats. Fear had become her armor, an invisible barrier keeping her safe but isolated from any touch of warmth. Meals turned into silent battles. The only sounds were silverware clinking against porcelain, marking the time between them like a clock beating too loud. Across the table, Edward could see the invisible wall separating him from his daughter, transparent, fragile, but impossible to break with words alone. He clumsily tried to get closer to her. He bought her a huge teddy bear, hoping it would fill the empty chair next to her. Lucy accepted it, hugged it politely, and then placed it by her bed. But she didn't treat it as comfort, just as another object in a world where emotions had no safe place to land. He took her to the supermarket, encouraging her to pick whatever she wanted, even the most expensive ice cream in the freezer. "Come on, honey, pick whatever you want," he said, forcing a smile. Lucy's small hand clung to his sleeve as she stopped in front of the freezer. Her finger pointed to the cheapest carton of vanilla. Then she hesitated, eyes searching his face, checking, waiting for approval. "Are you sure about that?" Edward asked quietly. "You can choose whatever you want." "I am sure, sir," she replied in a soft tone, learned, devoid of any emotion. That single word, "sir," broke something inside him. Sir. Then Edward finally understood. All his efforts, gifts, and kind words were the clumsy attempts of a man who had never learned to enter his daughter's fragile world. Lucy's calm wasn't peace. It was distance. A still surface hiding deep, cold waters she didn't dare dive into. Helen Vance, the family's lifelong housekeeper, watched that silent struggle as she packed her suitcase to return home. She knew she couldn't intervene. It was a wound Edward had to face alone. Years ago, when Amelia died, he had buried his pain in work, and in doing so, he had also buried his daughter's need for him. That afternoon, Edward sat in his study, pretending to focus on blueprints, but his attention constantly drifted to the faint sounds coming from Lucy's room. On his desk lay a letter from Helen, the same one he had ignored weeks ago. The letter spoke of that stormy night in the kitchen, a night he had tried to forget. He unfolded it again. Helen's handwriting was firm, almost solid in its compassion. "Claire's stubbornness is born of fear, Edward. But the real battle isn't with her. It's inside you." He read the last lines over and over, the ink etching itself into his mind like a silent truth. She doesn't need someone better. She needs her father to stay. Edward folded the letter carefully. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The silence around him grew until it felt alive, heavy, suffocating. But honest. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he had always sought an external solution. Someone to replace Amelia. Someone to keep order. Someone to fix what he didn't dare face. He had never realized that the answer had been sitting right in front of him. Across the table, waiting for him to simply be present. That night. For the first time, Edward didn't go into Lucy's room to say goodnight. He didn't want to disturb that fragile sense of peace his daughter had managed to build. Instead, he sat silently in the hallway, sinking into the worn armchair next to her door. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just listened to the soft rustle of her blanket, the gentle rhythm of her breathing. And for a fleeting instant, in that stillness between father and daughter, something changed. The silence that had once separated them began very slowly to sound like the beginning of an understanding. The next morning, Edward walked into the kitchen with an unfamiliar clumsiness, that of a man who has decided to start over. He didn't rush to turn on the coffee maker or open his laptop. Instead, he pulled out the chair across from Lucy and simply sat down. He didn't try to fill the silence with words. He was just there. Lucy sat across from him, silently nibbling her toast, her small shoulders still tense, carrying that cautious stillness born of habit. Edward began to eat too slow, deliberate, as if relearning how to savor food, to live a moment without rushing. Then, the inevitable happened. Distracted for a second, Lucy dropped her spoon. Clink. A small sound, but in the stillness of that room, it was like thunder splitting the air. Lucy froze instantly, hunching her shoulders, bracing for the scolding or the cold stare that usually followed such accidents. Edward paused. He didn't frown. He didn't sigh. He bent down, picked up the spoon carefully, and placed it gently in the sink. When he looked back at his daughter, he gave her a small, crooked smile. Clumsy but authentic. Then he simply returned to his breakfast as if nothing had happened. Lucy watched him, eyes wide. First came confusion, then disbelief. There was no anger. There was no punishment. Only calm acceptance. She said nothing, but she finished her toast in peace. It was a small victory. Silent, but profound. The kind that doesn't need applause, only patience. That afternoon, Edward brought out sheets of paper and a box of colored pencils. It was the first time he had done so since Amelia's death. I'm not a very good artist, he admitted, looking at Lucy. Do you think you could teach me? Maybe show me how to draw the things you like? Lucy hesitated. The pencil in her small hand seemed incredibly heavy, as if carrying all the loneliness she didn't know how to name yet. Edward began to draw insecure, shaky lines and even circles that didn't form anything. Then he deliberately drew a crooked house with a roof tilted to one side and smoke coming out of the chimney in clumsy square shapes. When he finished, he showed it to his daughter with a theatrical sigh. "Oh no," he said with fake despair. "I think your dad's career as an artist is officially ruined." Lucy looked at her father's ridiculous drawing. And then something miraculous happened. She laughed. At first, it was a small laugh, a brief, surprised sound. But soon it blossomed into a real giggle, light and musical, resonating in the silent house joy that hadn't been heard in a long, long time. Edward's heart clenched. That fragile but luminous laugh felt like a ray of sun breaking through after an endless winter. It was the first time in months he had heard his daughter laugh. From that day on, their drawing sessions became a sacred ritual at dusk. Mornings also became softer. They shared breakfast while Edward talked about the weather or the little birds perched on the window, and their silences no longer weighed heavy. They transformed into tender pauses, companions speaking of healing. Little by little, Lucy began to share pieces of her world. Small stories from school. Something funny her teacher had said, or the stray puppy that roamed the playground. And sometimes, she asked questions for which no father is truly prepared. "Dad?" she asked one night while coloring a green forest. "Why are adults so angry?" Edward put down his pencil and looked at her intently. That question caught him off guard. "Because adults forget to breathe," he replied softly. "They forget to say they are afraid, and so they speak with anger instead." Lucy sat reflecting. Then came the question that squeezed his chest. "Did Mom ever get mad at you?" "Your mom?" he replied with a faint smile. "Oh yes, she knew how to get mad. She was very good at it. But she was even better at forgiving. She taught me that every mistake can be fixed as long as the heart keeps trying." Lucy didn't answer, but her pencil moved with new firmness across the paper. Edward didn't always have the perfect answers, but he always ended their conversations the same way, with honesty. "I'm still learning too, Lucy. Learning to be a better version of your dad." One afternoon, when the sun was already hiding behind the mountains outside Seattle, Helen packed her suitcase to go home. While tidying up Claire's old room, she found a small wooden box hidden at the back of the closet. There were no jewels inside, only crumpled papers, medical records with Amelia Lawson's name, and some notes written with a trembling hand. Before we continue, please take a moment to leave a comment about this story and rate it from 1 to 10. How are you feeling? If there's anything you'd like to share, I'm always here to listen. I hope you find a moment of peace and reflection as you follow this healing story and its journey of courage and justice. Helen didn't read them all. She didn't need to. The pain seemed to seep directly from those pages. Silently, she placed the box on Edward's desk. "There are things you should know," she said calmly. "About Claire. About Amelia, and about what really happened that night." When Lucy was already asleep, Edward opened the box. Inside was a small, fragile diary. Claire Miller's words, scribbled with panic, fear, and regret. "That night I left my shift early. Only 15 minutes. I was exhausted. I thought she would be okay. The rain was so heavy. I couldn't hear her calling me. I ran, I left. And someone's light went out because I was selfish." A chill ran down Edward's spine as he read. Everything made sense now. Claire's fear of storms. Her obsession with control. She had been punishing herself for years, trying to rewrite a mistake that was deeply engraved in her soul. He turned to the last page, where the ink had run under the weight of tears. "I never wanted to scare the child. I simply didn't know how to love without causing harm. I am someone who does not deserve to be forgiven." Edward closed the box slowly, feeling a tide of emotions impossible to name. There was no anger left in him, only a bittersweet understanding. Claire hadn't been cruel. She was broken, trapped in her guilt, using discipline as a shield because she feared that love would once again bring loss. Edward walked to Lucy's room. She was sleeping deeply, hugging the teddy bear he had given her. Edward sat beside her and gently stroked her hair. In that silence, he understood something profound. All the pain, all the misunderstandings since Claire's departure, even his own silence, it had all started with absence. He had been absent when Amelia needed him. Absent when Lucy needed him. Absent when Claire needed compassion instead of judgment. He clenched his fist tightly as a promise formed silently within him. Never again. He would not disappear again. Not from his daughter. Not from love. Not from life. In the days that followed, the house began to find a quiet rhythm, soft, constant, and strangely peaceful. Edward stood in the kitchen, staring at Claire's wooden box resting on the table. The night before, after reading those trembling words of confession, something inside him had changed. The cutting edge of rage had vanished, replaced by a heavy, painful, sad understanding. Claire had never been a monster. She was simply a wounded soul struggling to live under rules no human heart could bear. That morning, Edward took the wooden box outside to the giant oak tree in the garden where Lucy used to play. The air was still damp, the grass fresh under his shoes. He sat down and opened the box one last time. Each sheet, each letter contained a fragment of pain, but also a desperate yearning for forgiveness. Did he read them again, not to judge, but to remember? He understood that every tragedy had been born not of cruelty, but of fear, loneliness, and the absence of love. He folded the papers carefully, tied them with rough twine, and placed them back inside the box. It wasn't an act of denial, but a silent ritual of release. Edward took a small shovel and began to dig a shallow hole under the roots of the oak, where the earth was soft and cold. When the hole was ready, he placed the box inside and covered it with dirt. It wasn't a burial of guilt, but a promise to let the pain finally rest. When he finished, Lucy came out into the garden wrapped in her knitted sweater. She saw her father standing with a small shovel in his hand, dirt still clinging to his fingers. "Dad, what are you doing?" she asked quietly. Her voice no longer held the tremor of fear. It sounded curious. Open. Edward looked up, wiped his palms, and smiled faintly. "It's a secret, my love," Edward said softly. "Something from the adult world that needs to sleep now. I'm burying it so it won't hurt anyone anymore. Lucy approached, her little eyes observing the small mound of fresh earth. She asked no more questions. Somehow, she understood that certain burdens could only be alleviated by letting them rest. She knelt beside her father, pressed her tiny hands against the dirt, and carefully added another layer. Then she picked up a twig with some wildflower buds and placed it on top. It was a silent farewell, tender and pure. Edward looked at her, and for a moment he didn't see a child, but a small spirit learning grace, the quiet wisdom of acceptance. That afternoon they sat together in the living room. Edward was reading a book and Lucy was building a castle with wooden blocks. For the first time, she moved her chair a little closer to him. Not much, just enough so their shoulders were within reach. A new girl came to school today, Lucy said in a small but firm voice. Her name is Emma. She brought apple pie. Edward closed the book. Did you try it? Lucy nodded. It was really good. Edward smiled. In that simple moment, he saw a reflection of Amelia in his daughter. The same warmth, the same light. But this time, the memory didn't hurt. It comforted him. Then he realized that love never disappears completely. It just changes form, transmitting like light through leaves. For the first time in years, Edward didn't feel the weight of his career or the pressure of the outside world. Only a determined calm, the resolve to slow down. He had spent too much time building things that could crumble. Now he would invest in what couldn't be destroyed. Connection, laughter, and the fragile miracle of being present. That night, after Lucy fell asleep, Edward didn't stay in the hallway as he used to. He entered her room silently, adjusted the blanket over her small shoulders, and sat in the chair by the bed. His hand rested tenderly on her forehead, feeling the soft warmth of her skin. He didn't need to say a word. His silence was full of meaning. He knew the road to healing would be long, irregular, and uncertain. But they had already found the foundation. The first stones of trust. The first signs of peace. Under the garden oak, Claire Miller's memories rested in the earth, but her lesson remained alive. Edward had learned that sometimes chaos is necessary to break the illusion of perfect order and make room for something true. And now it was his turn to teach Lucy what forgiveness really means. To forgive those who hurt them. To forgive those who couldn't stay. And most importantly, to forgive themselves. Time moved forward gently, almost with caution. Change didn't come to the Harper house by any miracle, but through small, clumsy, patient efforts. Edward had learned the silent art of listening without speaking, of loving simply by being present. Lucy began to change too. She no longer woke up alone in the dark. Every morning she got up before her father, walking barefoot to the kitchen with a new kind of confidence. She no longer helped him prepare coffee out of obligation. She did it to share the moment. The kitchen, once a place full of tension and echoes of shouting, had become the place where their mornings began under the soft golden light of dawn. Afternoons were dedicated to drawing and learning together. Lucy's sketches became firmer. She had started using colors again, bright yellows. Warm reds, tones that brought life and joy back to the pages. One morning, while Edward was folding her blanket, he noticed Lucy looking silently out the window. "Did you have a dream, honey?" he asked softly, careful not to interrupt the memory in which she seemed lost. Lucy turned to him, her gaze deep, as if she had just returned from a faraway place. "I dreamed about the rain," she whispered. "There was a woman standing under it, washing my dress. It was dirty, and she kept scrubbing and scrubbing until her tears mixed with the water." Edward froze. He didn't need to ask who that woman was. It was Claire Miller. Not the cruel woman they once feared, but the tormented one, trapped in her obsession with order, cleanliness, and control. That dream was Lucy's way of remembering, not with pain, but with empathy. Edward placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Was she cold?" Lucy shook her head. "No, she wasn't cold. She was just sad." Edward said nothing more. He let the image remain. He knew healing meant allowing the memory to exist without fear. Seeing it, feeling it, and still staying calm. The rhythm of the Harper house outside Seattle became softer. At night, Lucy started cooking with her father. When she spilled flour or cracked an egg with too much force, Edward didn't raise his voice. He just smiled, handed her a towel, and said, "Everything can be cleaned, Lucy. The important thing is learning how to fix it. Don't be afraid of the mess." Little by little, Lucy understood that mistakes didn't bring punishment. Fear had silently drained out of their home, leaving space for trust to grow. Before returning to her hometown, Helen Vance went to see Edward one last time. She took his hand, eyes full of gratitude. "You did it, Mr. Harper," she said quietly, looking toward the living room. "Lucy is no longer the same girl as before. Yesterday she dropped a bowl. She just looked at me. She didn't cry. She wasn't scared. She picked up the pieces herself. Thank you for staying." Edward nodded, emotion tightening his throat. When he looked at his daughter, she was sitting on the floor with legs crossed, drawing with colored chalk. But there were no shaky circles or lonely houses anymore. Now she was drawing something new, a luminous image of two people holding hands under a gentle drizzle. It was him and Lucy. That night before sleeping, Lucy called out softly, "Dad? Edward?" The nickname, so tender, so full of trust, melted something inside him. Do you think Mom Claire is still sad?" she asked. The question floated heavy in the air. Edward sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of all the truths he had read in Claire Miller's trembling handwriting. Her guilt, her fear, her regret. "I think," he said finally, looking at the drawing she had made earlier, "that maybe she isn't afraid anymore." Lucy nodded, hugging her teddy bear tightly. "I don't hate her, Dad. She taught me about order, but I wish she had found a dry place to hang her dresses." Her voice was innocent, but her words carried a wisdom that pierced Edward's heart. A 9-year-old girl had found forgiveness before he even understood he needed it. Lucy could see beyond Claire's hardness. She could see the sadness living beneath it. That image, the dress hanging in the rain, without ever drying, became a symbol for Edward. It wasn't just about Claire. It was about all of them. True healing would only come when they stopped running from the storm. Edward understood. Then that burying Claire's wooden box hadn't closed the story. He still owed his daughter and himself a true ending. He needed to know that somewhere, somehow, Claire had finally found that dry and quiet place. So he made a decision. The next morning, he would start looking for her. Not to reopen old wounds, but to finally let them rest. The search began silently, almost shyly, through old files at City General Hospital, faded patient records, and a series of unanswered calls to small rural clinics. But then a fragile lead emerged, pointing to the mountains in the north, a place known for isolated retreats and endless fog. Where rain was more faithful than the sun, he left early the next day, officially telling himself it was just another site inspection for a new architectural project. But deep down he knew it was something else. Something he couldn't name. Something closer to atonement. It took him 2 days of driving along winding roads before arriving at a small mountain town where wooden houses clustered under a gray sky, and the smell of pine floated in the humid air. In the only coffee shop in town, Cloud Calf, he found an elderly woman knitting by the window. The aroma of roasted coffee mixed with that of rainwater seeping under the door. Edward approached. "I'm looking for someone," he began, describing Claire in vague fragments. Ash blonde hair, thin, with quiet eyes that almost never looked straight ahead. The woman stopped her needles and observed him curiously. "And what does she do?" "She used to be a nurse," Edward replied. "Now, I'm not sure. But she has a habit. She likes to wash and hang clothes, even when it rains." The woman's lips curved into a faint smile, one that carried a hint of recognition. "Ah, must be Miss Claire Miller. She works at St. Jude's home, up there, near the peak. She spends her days washing the orphans' clothes. She is a kind soul, but she carries a heavy sadness. Her hands never rest, as if she's always trying to clean something other than fabric." Does she still hang clothes when it rains? Edward asked. Always, replied the woman softly. People think it's strange, but she says the rain cleans better than soap. She believes the smell of rain brings comfort to the children. No machines, no shortcuts. Just ropes, wind, and patience. A shiver ran through Edward. That phrase, the rain cleans everything, was the same one Helen had mentioned once. The one that had left him with a sense of unease. Now he understood why. But Claire wasn't running from her past. She was living inside her own ritual of forgiveness. He drove up the narrow path toward St. Jude's, where the road disappeared into the mist. The building emerged like a whisper among the pines. Stone walls, old bells, and the distant echo of children's laughter. The drizzle became denser, transforming into steady rain. Behind the building, Edward found her. Claire was bent over a wooden tub, sleeves rolled up, moving her hands rhythmically in the freezing water. Around her, clotheslines crisscrossed the yard, laden with rows of small gray sweaters and worn cotton dresses. The rain clung to the fabrics, making them heavy, shivering under their own weight. She wore a thick wool coat, old and patched. Her once ash-blonde hair now had streaks of silver, and her face looked thinner, etched with silent endurance. Her hands were cracked, reddened by the cold, but they moved with purpose, wringing out each garment with serene patience. Edward remained under the eaves, watching her. The world seemed to stop, leaving only the sound of the rain. After a long moment, Claire straightened up. She didn't turn immediately, but as if an invisible thread pulled her. Her eyes met his through the thin curtain of fog. There was no surprise on her face, no fear, no guilt. Only raw, complete understanding. She set aside the shirt she was rinsing, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked toward him. She stopped a few steps away, maintaining the respective silence. "Edward," she said in a voice that was low, serene, but firm. "Hello, Claire," he replied with a calm tone, softened by the rain. They stood like that, two people who had carried the same silence for too long. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a bridge. No explanations were needed. She didn't mention that stormy night at the Harper house, and he didn't speak of the wooden box or the words she had written. Finally, Edward broke the silence, not with questions, but with a gesture. "Lucy." He held out a small envelope. Inside was a drawing. "Lucy wanted you to have this," he said. "She made it herself." Claire hesitated before opening it. Her fingers traced the edges of the envelope as if afraid of disturbing something fragile. Inside was a drawing made with colored chalks. A woman standing in the rain, hair blown by the wind, and small dresses swaying on a clothesline around her. And behind her, holding hands, were Edward and Lucy. They weren't watching her with judgment, but with quiet hope. Above them, Lucy had painted a soft blue sky, clear, serene beyond the rain. Claire's eyes filled with tears. She didn't sob, but the tears fell free, warm and purifying, dampening the paper and blurring the pastel lines into soft shapes like watercolor. She forgave me," whispered Claire, her voice trembling. Edward nodded slowly. "Lucy doesn't hate you, Claire," Edward said softly. "She just hopes you find a dry place to hang your dresses." Claire looked up, and for the first time, Edward saw her eyes without that tormented shadow. What remained in them was peace, a faint smile blooming on her face like the first glimmer of dawn. "I think I already found it, Edward," she replied, looking toward the soaked garments waving behind her. "It's not dry here, but it's clean. And I've learned that as long as I don't run away again, I am not afraid." Edward didn't answer immediately. He simply nodded, feeling something shift silently within him. Claire didn't need to be saved anymore. She had saved herself in the only way she knew how, by giving, working, staying. The rain kept falling, washing the monastery yard, the ropes, and the past. And in that constant rhythm of water and breath, Edward finally understood that redemption doesn't arrive with thunder or lightning. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in the form of a woman hanging small dresses in the rain. A year had passed. The Harper house was no longer a museum of pain nor a fortress of false order. It had become a living home, a bit messy, imperfect, and full of laughter that didn't need to sound beautiful to be real. Edward was still a successful architect, but he had learned to divide his life. He turned down projects that demanded months away from home. Lucy no longer chased perfection or control. She sought balance, a life that could breathe. Lucy was 10 years old now. Taller, thinner, and above all, alive again. Her laugh was no longer that small, fearful sound. It was clear, luminous, spontaneous. It resonated through the house when she cooked with her father or when they lay together on the old armchair reading side by side. She had learned something powerful, that being clumsy didn't mean being punished. The piano in the living room remained silent, but it no longer hurt. Edward didn't need to fill Amelia's absence with music. He had learned to fill it with life. That spring arrived late, dragging a chain of endless rains. One afternoon, the sky darkened without warning, promising another storm. Edward was sitting in the living room reading the paper when he perceived a faint scent of soap and humid air. Edward looked up. Lucy was on the porch. Not hiding the laundry from the rain, but bringing out more. "Lucy, what are you doing out there?" shouted Edward, stepping out. Lucy turned. Her cheeks were flushed, not with fear, but with excitement. She was hanging her cotton dresses on the clothesline, each one waving under the weight of the wind. "I'm hanging them," she said simply, as if that explained everything. The first drops began to fall, darkening the fabric. "But it's raining, honey," said Edward, letting his adult instinct out. "They'll get wet again." Lucy didn't stop. She looked up at the gray sky, at the rain falling softly on the pastel dresses swirling slightly in the wind. "I like the rain, Dad," she said with a serene and calm voice. "It makes everything smell clean. Miss Claire used to say it, but I never fully understood. Now I do. The rain smells honest. It's not scary anymore." Edward stood motionless and watched. As the rain gathered on the hems of his daughter's dresses, drops shining like tiny lights. Her words, those of a child, closed a circle he didn't know was still open. The rain was no longer a reminder of regret nor a symbol of punishment. It had become something else, a silent form of forgiveness. Then he understood that everything that had once broken inside that house had taken a new shape. Not perfect, not polished, but authentic. They were no longer rebuilding Claire's order or Amelia's perfection. They were rebuilding honesty. Edward took a step forward. He noticed one of the clothespins was loose, so he adjusted it, pressing it into place. He said nothing, simply stood next to his daughter, both watching the dresses sway in the rain. Lucy reached out and took his hand. Her small fingers no longer trembled. They were warm, confident, full of quiet strength. "I'm not afraid anymore, Dad," she whispered. Edward squeezed her hand gently. He knew what she referred to. She wasn't talking about the rain or Claire. She was talking about everything that had haunted her since Amelia's death. She no longer feared the mess, the mistakes, or the silence that once seemed endless. "Me neither, daughter," replied Edward softly. He felt gratitude bloom where guilt used to live. Gratitude for Claire, who despite her own demons, had been the rough bridge that led him to this moment. Gratitude for Amelia, who taught him the meaning of unconditional love. And gratitude for Lucy, who had taught him to forgive long before he understood he needed to. The rain kept falling, but it wasn't cold. It was purifying, carrying the scent of wet earth and life itself. Edward leaned down, kissed his daughter's head, and looked back at the small dresses, once soaked in guilt and rigidity, now shining with freedom. They wouldn't dry perfectly without the sun, but that was okay. They were accepted just as they were. In that instant, Edward understood that he and Lucy had found their own kind of inner light. The piano might remain silent, but the house wasn't. It had found a new melody, that of forgiveness, of laughter, and of the soft rhythm of rain on the roof. Finally, they had found life again. Over the years, the seasons folded one over another, and the Harper house finally shed its mantle of mourning to become simply a home. Lucy turned 16. Her movements were graceful, sure. She didn't grow up to be a pianist like Amelia, but a quiet and diligent student interested in botany life that persists despite the elements. Edward, nearing 50, had learned to leave his desk before sunset. He began to value the ordinary, the shared silence of reading side by side, the clumsy laughter over a burnt dinner, the peaceful rhythm that replaced the rigid schedules of yesteryear. One late autumn afternoon, the sky turned a deep purple, promising heavy rain. Lucy was packing a small bag for a weekend with her friends. She stopped by the old oak in the garden, the one with the slightly raised mound of earth at the base. "Dad?" she called, turning toward Edward, who was trimming the overgrown rosemary bushes. "Did you ever find out if the woman in my painting? If Claire is really okay?" Edward stopped pruning. The scent of rosemary, strong and clean, filled the air. He hadn't spoken Claire's name in years, yet the memory of the rain-soaked home remained as vivid as then. "Yes, my girl," he replied, walking toward her. "Yes." But he gave no further details about that brief and silent encounter. They were stories that deserved the dignity of privacy. She found a place where she can work, where she is needed. A place where the rain no longer forces her to hide. Lucy nodded with an expression of serenity and closure on her face. "I used to think she was trying to clean me as if I were a mess that needed fixing. But now I think what she wanted was to clean herself, and she didn't know how to stop." Edward put a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "That is a deep truth, Lucy, and it is something very hard to learn. You know you can't erase the past. You can only learn to live with the echoes." Lucy smiled with an empathic maturity Amelia would have recognized. "But echoes aren't always bad, you know? Sometimes they just remind you where the silence used to be." Then she did something unexpected. Lucy walked to the old abandoned piano in the living room. It hadn't been tuned in years. The keys were yellowed by time and disuse. She didn't sit down to play a complicated melody. She simply pressed one key, a middle C, and held it, letting that slightly out-of-tune sound resonate through the room. The sound remained melancholic, but real before fading away. "That's enough, right?" asked Lucy, looking at her father. "More than enough," replied Edward, his voice thick with emotion. He remembered the day Lucy had played that solitary note for the first time. Years ago, right after Amelia's funeral. Before Claire arrived. That note had been a question, a plea. Now it was a declaration. "I am here." As Lucy prepared to leave, the heavens opened and it began to rain hard. It wasn't a soft drizzle, but a deafening downpour shaking the windows. Instead of running to close them, Edward and Lucy stood at the edge of the porch, listening to the roar of the storm. Suddenly, Lucy laughed. She looked at the rain, then at her father. "I still love how it makes the fabric smell clean, Dad," she said, her voice rising above the roar of the downpour. Edward understood exactly what she meant. They had stopped trying to control the rain, the pain, or the imperfect memory of the women who had come and gone. They simply embraced the scent left behind. He reached out and took his daughter's hand, feeling the firmness in her grip. It was no longer the fearful cling of a child, but the secure connection between two survivors who had finally learned the most important lesson of all, that life, like love, rarely comes in the tidy desire. It arrives soaked, messy, and for that very reason, infinitely more beautiful. The old house, once cold and silent, was now full of a deep and simple truth, that of its continued existence. Standing firm against the drumming of the storm. And that, dear friends, is tonight's bedtime story. A story that began with a simple dining table and became a silent awakening for three souls under the same roof. A father who returned in silence, a stepmother consumed by her guilt, and a girl trying to rebuild the pieces of lost trust. What did you feel listening to it? Did your heart ache for Lucy, the little one who had to grow up surrounded by adults who never learned to truly love? Or did you see yourself reflected in Claire Miller, the woman desperate to correct her mistakes, but who ended up losing herself in the attempt? And what about Edward Harper, the father who believed peace meant control, until discovering that it actually meant letting go? Tell me in the comments what you think. Which moment touched your soul the most? Claire's empty gaze? Lucy's fragile words? or the silence that followed Edward's understanding? I would love to read your thoughts and discover how each of us interprets pain, healing, and forgiveness in our own way.